Hi, so we're going to start the policy panel. If anyone wants to move further forward, there's a lot of space at the front. It might be easier for you to hear and engage, but so feel free to move further forward. And we've got Scott Wallsten, who's moderating this panel. So over to you, Scott.
All right, thank you. So this is the policy panel, as it's called. Let me just very quickly introduce the speakers, and then we'll jump right into it. I have my phone out because that's where I have my questions, not only because I want to watch Netflix while we're doing this. So also, I think we need some water grabbers. Anybody have a grabber? I can just get one. Okay, so well, first we have, I'm just going to go in alphabetical order, Mincheol, who's from the Korea Institute for Economics and Trade, Avi Goldfarb, who you know, see, there he is, and also right there, the Rotman Chair in Artificial Intelligence and Healthcare and Professor of Marketing at Toronto, Olivia Igokwe, Head of U.S. Congressional and Political Affairs at Amazon Web Services, Fabio Luzzi, who is the Global Head of Data and Analytics at Tapestry, and Elina Noor, who's Senior Fellow at the Asia Program at Carnegie. So let's start, before we actually get to some policy. Some of the papers talked about the use of AI in particular countries, Korea and Denmark. By the way, I really like that somebody from Denmark used Legos in their presentation. But let's start with Olivia. Tell us what you can about AI use broadly. Like, how do we measure its use? What's happening? How are companies using it? How do you see it spreading throughout? So this is you've got a very unique view on this.
Yeah, I think I might have a different perspective because AWS has so many customers across so many genres, across so many areas, and then both domestically and internationally. So I just had a conversation with a member of Congress this morning about it, where he said AI is coming, and I was like, AI is here. Like we see it in healthcare, we see it in agriculture, we see it in defense. I mean, it's permeating everywhere, and I just think that it's only growing. And then I think one way of tracking it is going to be with generative AI, like the amount of energy that's needed to support that compute. You know the regions in which it's currently being held, because that's how much energy it takes to sustain it. That might be a way of tracking, but otherwise, I think it's just the ever-growing presence that people are going to see, whether it's the transcribing of a voice text to, healthcare screenings for cancer.
And so I know you can't say anything about AWS specifically. That's not in company reports. But do you see increased trends in energy use that's related to generative AI?
I think that, not saying that we personally see it, but the amount of energy that it takes to operate is something that is notable. And so anyone would be able to know what regions have generative AI capabilities based on that energy use.
Okay. Let's now move on. Let's hear from Fabio for a minute. So if you're actually using this or thinking about how to use it, tell us, give us this case study.
Thank you, Scott. And by the way, we are a big AWS customer, so thank you for your side. I also have some notes here, so don't mind my phone. But anyway, so just to give you a little bit of context to understand, how we use AI. So I work for Tapestry. For the one who are not familiar with the company, so we're a retail and fashion. So Tapestry is a house of fashion brand. We own three brands: Coach, Kate Spade, and Stuart Weitzman. So very traditional New York-based brands. Coach has been around since 1941. So very traditional retail and fashion brands. And the business is one important thing to mention is that we are a data-rich company. So we are, for the most part, direct to consumer, 90% direct to consumers between stores and online. So we have a lot of data, transactional level data. That, combined with the fact that the business is very complex, it makes it a perfect candidate for leverage data and advanced analytics like ML and AI to help with decision making. And that's the vision of my team, right? So how to leverage this data asset that we've been building and how to monetize it and how to leverage it to help make decisions. So now the business, as I said, is very complex. I don't know if you're probably familiar with retail and fashion, but it's very long lead times. It takes about a year to make a leather bag. From design all the way to when the bag is available on the store, it's a year. So if you think of the value chain, we start from design. So everything starts with a financial target. So finance planning and designers start working together with that target in mind. They collaborate with merchants. The merchants put together an assortment, which is basically the menu of products that we will build, that the buyers come in and decide how to invest. They have a budget, how to invest on their assortment, given the target. And then the supply chain starts. Pre-commercial, so to decide how much raw material we need. And then once the buyers is finished, the actual production of the goods. Then after that, so outside of the suppliers, there is logistics and transportation. So moving the goods from the suppliers to the distribution centers. And then from that, actually selling it to the customers. So it's a very complex value chain. And we've been leveraging data analytics across all of it. So downstream, it's easier because it's closer to the selling the good. And as you go upstream, obviously, it's more difficult because the forecasting window is much longer, right? We're talking about 9 to 10 months of forecasting. But so different use cases. So starting downstream, one successful use case on how we've been leveraging data and AI and ML is through demand forecasting models and optimization model. We help optimize allocation of products, finished goods from the distribution centers to the stores. So basically, the goal is to how much SKUs, how much goods to allocate when and to which stores. So product and store level demand forecasting and optimization. By doing that, obviously, it was a complex project because it was a cross-functional project between the data science team, IT, and the allocation team. We ran an experiment. Long story short, we were able. It's now a live solution. It's and just to give an idea of some KPIs, we are automating up to 90% of the decisions based on the department. So some departments are still manual, especially newness, which is more difficult to forecast. But so automation in Japan, it's almost 100% automated. And then we were able to reduce stockouts up to 25%, which translated into a reduction of lost sales of single-digit millions of dollars.
And is this from use of machine learning or AI, or is it other kinds of data analytics?
So we can call it AI because the actual models that we're using for forecasting demand, it's a combination of different neural networks. So yeah, this specific use case we're using neural networks.
Had you been trying to use some of this data beforehand, and were unable to, or is this sort of a whole new approach? The overall vision, the reason why I'm in Tapestry, it's to transform the company. It's a digital transformation. So this is an example of a transformation, right? So traditionally, these decisions were made leveraging data, but like more of naive forecasting models, like moving averages, and then just gut feeling and expertise of the allocators. And it's a very manual intense because every day they have to decide how much to allocate for hundreds of thousands of SKUs. We have 1,400 stores across the globe. So, number of SKUs times number of stores is a very data intensive. So this is a specific use case that we were able to automate, so make more efficient and more accurate through the demand forecasting. So here's a policy question that I think none of us really know the answer to, but especially in fashion, that's a very intellectual property intensive area, right? You've got to protect your IP very carefully. But there's also this question in AI now about the training models and whether they violated IP by using those training models. So a business like yours is on both sides of this. You've got IP that must be protected, but there may be IP issues on the training side of it. I don't know the answer to that. I don't even know if it's a legitimate concern when people say they're talking about copyrighted or IP, using IP, copyrighted things for training. I don't know. Avi, do you have any thoughts on that? Sorry to put you on the spot.
So, okay.
And a solution.
It is a big open question. So that, so the easiest way to think about it is I showed you a picture of an astronaut on a horse in the style of Andy Warhol at the beginning, and that wasn't an Andy Warhol. But so who has the copyright to that? And that's maybe even easier because at least it was in the style of, and that was explicit. So maybe we could say, well, maybe that is something that the artist or the artist's estate should get something from. Where in other contexts, like in fashion, I can imagine saying, well, hey, here's a bunch of images, design a purse in the style of a Coach purse, but that fits somebody with these characteristics or something like that. It's not something you designed. Is that something that's IP? It's trained on a bunch of Coach bags, but a knockoff can do that. It doesn't have the Coach label on it. We're allowed to design things that look like things that are out there already, and so there's a big, it's a big opportunity for the, for lawyers.
Most things are.
And I don't think the laws. Pam Samuelson has had some discussions of this about where at least she thinks it all lands, but that's where she thinks it lands, and ultimately it's going to be a court decision how we think this through.
Right, probably several, I would imagine. Yeah. And before we're going to have an international perspective on this too, but there was a hearing yesterday in the Senate on AI, I guess this is really for anybody. I mean, what are your thoughts on where policymakers are in terms of how well they understand the issues, the kinds of things they're thinking about, and what they are proposing? It's just a narrow, small question.
I think that it's a long way to go, but if you look at something as tangible as like the Senate and House AI caucuses, when I first started on federal AI policy about 4 years ago, because really at the state level before, it's still emerging in the federal landscape. I would say that there are half a dozen members in each caucus, definitely not even 12. Now it's 5 times the amount, and I think by the end of next Congress, you'll have over 100 members in the House, on the House side.
And do you think they're doing a good job of educating, well, the staffers have to be educated and the staffers have to educate the members? Are they? That's
hard. So I think Ted Lieu is one of 3 or 4 members with a computer science degree on the House side, and now you have like Rep. Beyer, who's going back to get his master's at 73, 74 in ML. And so you have anomalies like that, but everyone else is just kind of learning and trying to keep up with, I think, the American public, honestly. I think we're very beltway industry policy based, and so we think generative AI is what people are talking about at their kitchen tables. I guarantee you the majority of people in our lives haven't even tried ChatGPT yet. So education is still very necessary.
Was that apparent in the hearings yesterday? Anybody want to comment on? No?
I mean, the questions that are, the questions were fine.
Yeah, I think the question, compared to where we were a few years ago, they're clearly paying attention. My IO training always makes me worry that calls for regulation are calls for helping incumbents. But the general tone was quite sensible, and the worries were sensible. And how it's actually going to play out, I'll leave that maybe to the others on the panel.
Right. I mean, so the tone and the worries were sensible, but one of the things they talked about was establishing a new agency to deal with AI. Now, as a moderator, I want to remain neutral, but I think that's idiotic. Any thoughts?
Okay, so I'm going to interview. Why do you think it's idiotic?
No, but seriously, are they? Does anybody disagree? But where should they be going? They're educating themselves. That's a useful thing, always a useful thing to do, and the fact that they're taking it seriously is important. But there's a lot of pressure to do something, and what can they do that might be productive? Because even if we think doing nothing is the right thing, that may not be possible.
I think the NIST risk management framework, the RMF, is a good start.
Okay.
There are a few ISO standards. If we want to have international cooperation, that's a good start. But I do believe that it'd be very hard for Congress to pass legislation on an area that the majority of Congress is still catching up on and learning.
Standards is a good point. I don't know if you want to say anything more about that, because that's always such a huge part of how a new technology develops and so on.
I think that international standards are important, because what's going to happen is the states are far ahead in terms of what they're doing on a state level as opposed to a federal level. I think we can look at like GDPR and compare that to EU AI Act. GDPR passed. And everyone who's a multinational that does business in the EU has to comply by it, and it may or may not be ideal, depending on the person who has to adopt the law. But with the EU AI Act, again, it may or may not be ideal. But if we don't have our own legislation to kind of use as an example, we can't really tell. I don't know if you can really interject on another country moving forward. But it's going to be hard. I think there's something that is to be said. I don't know if we want like a California privacy, like a CCPA or a Vermont bill, or we don't want patchwork bills, so we're going to need something federally. But also, I don't think it needs to be rushed. It's necessary, but I think it's better for legislators to understand what they're doing before they start implementing things that are going to be significantly impactful.
This seems like, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say I agree. I mean, there seems to be a little bit of negativity now around AI, which is understandable. It's better to be safe than sorry. But there is a lot of good that comes out of AI. Like taking the example of my company, it's good not just for the business return of the enterprise, but we are reducing waste. We make a lot of goods using raw material and hardware, and so we use a lot of stuff. By optimizing our processes, we'll reduce waste and increase efficiency. So so education is key. There's a lot of good that comes out of it.
So let's expand this now. In Korea, how does the Korean government approach this? What issues are they specifically dealing with, and how are they having those sort of analog debates there that we're having here?
First of all, let me briefly introduce some trends in Korea's AI policy here. These days, Minister of Science and ICT, henceforth MSIT, which corresponds to the Office of Science and Technology Policy in the White House, leads the whole AI initiatives. And about 3 years ago, it announced a national strategy for AI, which which covers whole range of possible AI issues. And but here in Korea, most focus are on developing some technologies and gaining technology sovereignty. So it also has some issues about ethics or job safety.
What does technological sovereignty mean?
It means it's kind of technological competitiveness, but with some kind of supply chain issues. So I don't have much to talk about that kind of issue in perspective of Korean.
Oh no, that's fine. I just wanted to hear. Avi, did you want?
On your earlier question, like how do we think about policy? It's related to what you're just talking about. So just I think a real important starting point is thinking through which of our laws already apply. And so you talk about agencies. What can the FTC have control over? What does the Department of Justice have control over? And to the extent a lot of the worries around AI are things that we already have laws in the books for. Like, what do those look like? I don't think we have a good landscape on that. I'm sure there are law professors who've thought about it and have written their papers on it, but I don't think there's consensus on that yet, and there needs to be. And second, related to what you were just saying in terms of technology sovereignty was the language. So one version of thinking of that is standards. Another aspect of that is just recognizing soft power in technology. As we think about the kind of AI we want to build and the kind of AI that is legal from a regulatory point of view, but also in terms of what we allow our companies to do, recognizing that part of what happens when American companies go global is the American values embedded in those companies go global, is a first order, I think, concern's not the right word, thing to think about in the context of regulation.
So, sorry, say that last part again.
So, go back to the standards embedded in the internet.
Yeah.
Okay, which you know more about than just about anybody. Those embedded American values. The way the internet was searched, search processes were embedded various American values, and that internet ended up being the way a technology that the entire world used And so as we think about the next general purpose technology, we're recognizing that the leaders in that technology will get to embed their values in it is sort of a first order thing to think about.
Right, although that's an interesting thing when we have people who talk about AI in other countries here. I mean, like Min, you hear that, and what do you think? I mean, should we be embedding American values in AI?
I'm a Korean policy researcher, so I I'd be better silent.
But Elina, you study this in the context of South Asian countries and how they interact. How do you think about these issues?
I think the other element of policy that needs to be considered is ethics, right? And we haven't really talked about that in this discussion and the whole day. So maybe this sounds a little fluffy to a whole group of economists and people who work on regression models, but it's something that a lot of policymakers are thinking about in the region that I'm most familiar with, Southeast Asia. And that relates to the point about American values. I mean, this has been the case for like 30 years now, right? Since the advent of the internet. And Eric Schmidt wrote an article about this in Foreign Affairs recently about how the technology is one way to advance American values. But when you think about it, we often, in this town at least, talk about US in the context of China and this great technological competition between the two poles. For me, as a Southeast Asian in Washington, I find it remarkable that nobody ever talks about the more than 100 countries between these two poles that are often missing from the debate about technology and its values and standards that are being set. Because really when we think about, the US and China and the global South, really we're talking about the global majority that's being left out of many of these conversations.
So how do we bring them in?
There's this traditional talk about capacity building, right? Capacity building in cybersecurity, capacity building in technical training with AI, for example. And I think that's a great start. But there are also discussions and training that's going on in the policy and the legal fields about how we think about the governance frameworks of tech in general, and specifically in AI and cybersecurity frameworks. So unfortunately, a lot of other countries are trying to catch up to a number of these discussions, but keeping in mind that there are like all these countries that shouldn't just be considered a market of consumers and users to be pitched to, I think would make a really useful start.
But also when you talk about things like capacity building, in the case of governance, that assumes that somebody knows what they're doing. I mean, why should we believe that whatever we want to call the global north or rich countries, they don't know what they're doing. I mean, so how do we bring in all these other 100 countries into building the foundations of how we think about this? Also, Avi, aren't you Canadian? So what's with these American values?
I like American values.
I mean, it's a serious question because we're starting at the ground floor, and we shouldn't be ignoring these.
But there's an assumption amongst those of us in the global majority that global northwestern countries know what they're doing because they've had all these decades of development, and we tend to model our image of growth and development on those models, and that thinking has served us well up till now. The world is changing. We have a climate crisis. Talk about energy generation of computing models. And yet, in Southeast Asia, we're sort of in a rat race to get to how many data centers each country in Southeast Asia can build without taking into account, I guess, what in traditional, conventional economic thinking is externalities, right? So what environmental costs are there? Which indigenous populations are being displaced? What other communities are being left out of building these data sets? And the onus is really on countries in the global majority to think more creatively about how to advance tech.
So I mean, it's also, you bring up the point about different groups being left out. This relates to what the majority of of written text includes, it's mostly in English, and so lots of other languages are left out. And so this isn't exactly the same because the scale is still bigger. But is that an issue in Korea that there's just not as much Korean data to train on as there is for English? Yeah. I mean, I understand it's not the same as the South.
It's not exactly the case. It's not the exact case, but let me just one point. We Korean have AI graduate school. Yeah. Have you ever heard of it? Yeah.
AI grad school?
Yeah, AI graduate school. Yeah. Yeah. It began.
I mean, I'm sure we have things like that.
Yeah.
Or we will.
Yeah. As far as I know, Korea is also eager to train as many professionals as possible in order to gain the technological sovereignty in the field of AI and big data. But our wages are not that high to other leading countries. So we need to grow ourselves, our own professionals. So that one of the efforts is the AI graduate schools. It began in 2019 with 3 schools, and now we have 14 schools. And each school is granted by about $200 million for 10 years, and it gets some benefits in the regulation. So
Scott.
that is the closest point, I guess.
Okay. Yeah.
Sorry, no, I just wanted to jump in really quickly, just taking the example of Avi and anecdotes, right? So, for example, I guess the point that we in the global majority need to be thinking about is what is the end goal of optimization, right? We talk about like creating less friction in production. To what ends? And one example is that there's a startup that aims to neutralize accents, particularly of call center workers in India and in the Philippines. So these people who are working these centers sound more like your regular American because it's easier to understand to customers in North America. And the thinking behind that is the rate per hour for each of these workers is about $25 in the US. And these workers in the Philippines and India are paid half that because it's cheaper labor, but also because, according to this company, removing that accent, neutralizing that accent, would really increase their hourly wage to that of the average American call center worker, if any exists. I'm sure they do. And so that calculation is in purely economic terms, right? Like, so we'd be able to increase someone's wage and they'd have a better quality of life at the end of the day in India or the Philippines. But really, I mean, is that the only cost that we're thinking about? Neutralizing people's accents? Are we not thinking about what it means for their identity?
So what would you
ask them?
I was going to say, I think I used to work for, this is not my current company, my previous company, I used to work for a huge call center base. People in America are not getting $25 an hour, so I don't know what.
This is on the
So no, I'm
page,
saying, so I think that so, and then I don't think people overseas are getting $12.50 an hour, for sure. But I think that this is the thing that I can speak on. This is purely my example. It's like when people talk about how the biggest crisis in America is privacy, right? And there are members of Congress that will tell you, my constituents are not worried about privacy right now. That is not the biggest crisis in America. There's how they're going to eat, how they're going to pay their bills, other things. I think that if this study is correct, and people in underrepresented countries or underrepresented communities, even within the U.S. or outside, could double their salary as a result of an algorithm that changes their vernacular to make it more, I don't want to say palatable, because I think that's where the not anger, but where the discomfort is, by thinking it's more palatable. I think if you spoke, and this is, so background, my father's Nigerian and my mother's from India. And I can only speak for myself. If you ask my father, when he was in Nigeria, if he can double his salary and you're going to make his accent less to an American, he's going to does it double my salary? Like, I think sometimes we have to ask the person, or we have to ask whoever this is affecting, is the income that, if it's double, could significantly change the trajectory of your life, your family's life, et cetera, worth what this option is? And sometimes I think we see things through our own lenses, like, how can you minimize my accent? Whereas in some, I mean, I don't know, I just think it's something that has to be asked.
Sure.
I wouldn't mind sounding more American.
I'd like to sound
At
Italian.
times.
I'll take an Italian, I'd like a French accent. I mean, it'd be cool.
Only if it doubles your salary.
You don't, I mean, if I could, 10%, I'll do it.
But this, I mean, this also relates, I mean, this goes back to jobs too. This is an example of something that might help people keep jobs for a while. Usually, I thought you were going to say that these AIs will put all these people out of work, but that wasn't your point at all. So I think that's kind of interesting. Well, there is also that, right?
But AI is also creating a lot of jobs.
Right.
And I think that's something that we also miss. And also, not just creating jobs, the democratization of non-traditional tech communities. With the spread of AI, you're seeing we have programs called Machine Learning University. These are the actual programs that our own Amazon engineers have trained on that are now available at the community college level. We look at not only inner cities, we look at rural areas, community colleges, vocational schools. There's so many more jobs available now and not enough computer science degrees to meet that. And therefore, the onus is now on industry, and industry is actually taking up this responsibility to make sure that we're training non-traditional tech communities and really going out there to make sure that there's a workforce that isn't these traditional Silicon Valley four-year universities, et cetera. So I think that's something that's actually really commendable that we should also focus on.
Yeah, I mean, oh, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, just to build on that. So the other thing that related to this is underappreciated is a lot of these tools you think, oh, well, ChatGPT can write. Okay, so if you make a living writing, that might be a problem. But so many people's job prospects are constrained by the fact that they can't write.
Yeah.
And if now anybody can write and write well in English at scale, that should empower millions or billions at the expense, and let's be clear, at the expense of tens or hundreds of thousands. And so there is a short-run policy question about what do we do with those people, and who we should worry about. But there is also this long-run hope that a lot of the challenges that have led to sort of increased inequality over the past 40 years, and these technologies might be able to help. Anybody, okay, so not anybody can code yet, but somebody with 7th grade computer science can now code as well, arguably, as somebody who used to require a university degree. That's pretty amazing, related to your point, and it's going to empower lots of people to do things they couldn't otherwise do. That's equalizing, but it doesn't mean there aren't losers, and we do need to worry about the losers.
I think that we look at people within companies where English isn't their first language, like not having to spend as much time worried about if their emails are grammatically correct and if there's going to be an issue with who's receiving that email. Or I was with a member of Congress today who represents a large portion of the entertainment industry, and someone asked the question about the writer's strike and if ChatGPT would affect that. And he said a really great point that stuck with me, that he said the writer's strike is about streaming and getting paid as a result of that. But ChatGPT, as it is now, is not going to write a great Seinfeld episode. It's not Succession, right? Like, if you think about the value and the expertise of current writing for shows that we watch, I don't think that we're there yet. I clearly am not saying whether it's going to happen in the future, but currently I don't think that's something that we need to worry about.
Yeah, okay, so I'm fully optimistic on various things, but in terms of that, one thing to think about in terms of the writer strike in particular is you have a lead writer or a team of leads. They're good.
Oh, yes.
But they had a team who would unpack things and go through details, and now maybe instead of having to wait for your team to write for a week, you can create some prompts, get some feedback, and work with a much smaller team. Maybe that will lead to much better television and more television. And I don't know how to think about the equilibrium number of jobs in that context, but
it's the balance, yeah.
But some of those jobs will be, the jobs will change, and some of them might be replaced.
I mean, we're generally not good at compensating the losers of policies. I mean, even though the benefits will likely vastly outweigh, I mean, look at that trade adjustment assistance, that's like less than $1 billion, which we like spend at the drop of a hat now on everything else. But yeah. So how, so I'm just thinking of going through lots of different questions. How should Congress proceed? I mean, they have the hearing. They're kind of educating themselves. Should we be focused on trying to prevent states from going down their own roads with this in the meantime? Because that can generate lots of confusion. And this sort of, I guess, goes back to everybody feels like they need to do something, and nothing might not be an option. What can they do that's not going to be harmful?
Well, federal law constitutionally would be
If
that
they do something.
if they do something. But I think what Congress can do is use the resources that they have right now, which is one, learn more. We have the National AI Advisory Committee that is a superb organization made up of leaders from academia, industry, and nonprofit third parties. They work directly with Secretary of Commerce, Secretary Raimondo, OSTP, and those are probably global experts that they can start with in not just the education, but to have open dialogue with engineers, policymakers, et cetera, that span that committee on what can be done and how, and what's our starting point. What are the issues that we need to be made aware of, and how can we tackle this? I think that's one resource that's already there that they could leverage.
We should, I mean, if you have questions, raise your hand, let me know. I think there's a mic around. But that also, what I remember what I wanted to ask before. I mean, you said that the Korean government had a report 3 years ago, right, on AI. A lot has changed in 3 years. Maybe not for people who already knew about AI, but for the rest of us. Looking back at that report, does it capture the issues that people are thinking about today with generative AI and the potential effects on jobs and the ethical issues? I mean, does the report hold up? Because I look back at some things and think, wow, that was really foresightful, and other things, nope, missed the boat.
Yeah. The policies 3 years ago has no clear mention about the generative AI, but it has some kind of job safety policies. Yeah. I mean, the Korean government is very deeply concerned about job loss by AI at that time, even at that time, because and it said that it will create a platform, AI and big data-based platform, and job search platform and job search platform for people whose jobs will be highly replaced by AI. But I checked it recently, and there were no deals regarding that. But so that was very, I was very disappointed about that. Yeah.
Interesting. What about Canada? Is it doing anything? Where are they? What are they?
I guess that one's for me, right?
I mean, if you'd like.
So, so there's a bill before Parliament now for Canadian AI law.
Mr. Champagne.
That what?
Mr. Champagne. I just love
Yes,
his name.
yes, Mr. Champagne. That is, at least in my view, shockingly sensible. So it is not, an attempt to regulate everything the industry does. It is trying to think through where the market failures are, which is what you asked earlier. What's the starting point? The starting point, at least for economists, I don't know about for members of Congress, but for economists, is what are the market failures and what can we do about them? And so it's thinking through where are the market failures, externalities with respect to data, and a few other things, and then recognizing there's a difference between the big players and the small players, and trying to encourage, I think this is a bit of industrial policy, but trying to encourage an industry in Canada around AI that doesn't just get overwhelmed by the larger players. And so now, whether it's going to pass is an open. Usually in Canadian Parliament, once the government wants to do something, it just happens. But right now there's a minority government, and it may not. But at least the proposed legislation is quite sensible.
Do we want to talk about the AI Act in Europe? Anybody have opinions on that? I don't know if people haven't studied it. I don't necessarily need to go into it. But Europe seems to be about to take the lead in regulating AI because they want to control the entire digital economy, for better or for worse. Is there anything sensible in it that maybe we should follow?
I think it's overly broad and a little prescriptive. I think it is going to stifle innovation, and they've heard this feedback. I think the UK proposal is a little bit, I think, more sensible if you're going to, and that's why the UK has their divergence when necessary. And when it comes to this, the UK one is definitely more sensible. But once the trilogues are done, I think the EU Act is probably going to pass. And historically, I think the EU, with GDPR, they kind of just said, here it is, take it. It's been about 2 years of open dialogue about the EU Act. Now, if what we have said has been adopted is different, but step. I do think it's overly prescriptive. It's overly prescriptive, and it will stifle innovation in the EU.
Questions?
Thanks. First, this day has been terrific. This panel is very interesting. I want to appreciate the organizers, the presenters, and of course this panel. I want to raise a question, picking up on some things that Avi said in this morning in his keynote, but just got picked up in the discussion about democratization of knowledge. Avi, one of the things you said this morning was making a distinction between prediction and judgment, which for me is I'm not an AI expert, so I found that very helpful. And you gave some very compelling examples of very effective prediction in some specific contexts. What my question is, how generalizable is that high level of effective level of prediction, and what are the implications for us who are lay people who hope to be democratized? We know that ChatGPT, for example, you ask for a literature review in economics on the impact of father's absence on children's health, and you can get some good references back and a good summary, but you can also get ghost references. ChatGPT hallucinates, and some of us might be kind of paranoid and go and do our own literature review and make sure that what's there is okay and throw out what's not. But if you've got a 7th grade computer science education and you're a screenwriter and you throw something in and then you just take what you get out. Since I'm not that familiar with this field, I'd like to know, I'm not sure how it's a public policy issue necessarily, but what are companies doing, or what can individuals and companies do to ensure that this predictive power is effective in the way that you described this morning, and not throwing us way off with disinformation or actually making things worse rather than making things better? Okay,
so I thought you were starting with a narrow question and went really big. Okay, so
but you have an hour or so, so go ahead.
So I actually want to hear what you have to say on this one. So I'll give you a high level. These are prediction tools, and a human or team of humans still needs to provide the judgment, which at a high level is understanding which predictions to make and what to do with those predictions once you have them. Even in the ChatGPT context, where there is a prompt that is human judgment about what you want to know, and then it provides output, and then there is human judgment after the fact and reading it and deciding what to do with it. Okay. So there is a prediction inherent that, and that prediction itself also has some judgment on the training side. We'll leave that part away. Now, the people who succeed with it the most, remember, you're taking that information, and then there's a market out there where you interact with other humans who decide whether what you wrote is worth reading. That market depends on your ability to figure out what the right prompt is and your ability to look at what the output is and decide whether that's the kind of thing you want to put out in the world. And so there's still a lot of There's a big human role there. In any kind of AI, at least in today's AI, there's the what do you want to predict and what do you do with that prediction once you have it. What changes potentially is that sometimes you can specify in advance, like the hiring example I gave this morning, what to do with those predictions once you have them. And so there is, you could get to a point where there's no human in the loop. It's still a human deciding, or a team of humans, but it changes who. But you have experience with this in company, like on the ground, so you might have some.
Yeah, I can say something. So not related to text, because we don't have a use case yet. But what I can say in general is that even in the more transformative solutions where we try to automate as much as possible, there is always a human in the loop. So for example, one example of automation by leveraging AI in our company is a specific product category that we call evergreen. So when you go buy a black belt on a black wallet or a white T-shirt, a store should never run out of those things because they're evergreen, right? So people buy them all the time. So traditionally it was a manual process. The buyers would go through the process of deciding how much to buy of those goods, and et cetera, et cetera. But that demand is it's much easier to forecast because there's a lot of data, right? People buy that stuff a lot, so there's a lot of historical data, so they're very easy to forecast. We built a forecasting model using some kind of LSTM neural networks, and it performs. And by the way, this is a prediction that goes 9 months in advance, which is very, as you know, it's very hard to forecast so much in advance. But we don't really care that the model itself is not that accurate. We care that it's more accurate than human. So that model is 25% better than humans at making a prediction of how much of that product is going to sell. So now, because we have the model, we tested it, it's good, we can automate that process. But there is still somebody that is getting that forecast, looking at it based on some KPIs, as you said, right? There is some control mechanism that says, okay, this forecast doesn't look off. And then they push a button and it moves to the next step. So there is always, I see these tools as tools that humans use to make their job better. So, but usually there is always, most of the time there is a human in the loop to reduce risk. So it's not, I don't see AI, at least in my reality, as a replacement of humans completely. Obviously, in some cases, you need less, but these people now can focus on more, they don't have to do hundreds of manual calculations, right? They can focus more on strategic tasks, but there is always somebody there to supervise.
So this is interesting. I mean, you've got this actual use case here, and I wonder how much has ChatGPT turn the conversation in an unproductive direction as opposed to a productive direction? Because now everybody talks about ChatGPT and when it makes things up and when it hallucinates. And you should see all the papers I've written according to ChatGPT. It's amazing. But that's not, I mean, you're not using ChatGPT. I mean, there are all these innovations that have nothing to do with it. So are some of the policy debates on completely the wrong track because everyone's all about perfecting the chatbot when, in fact, the things that generate economic value is what you're doing?
Yeah, I mean, as you said before, right, AI has been around for a long time. I mean, we have self-driving taxis in some cities. So, but I think now there is this big hype because people can talk to it. So there is suddenly like, okay, this is somebody I can talk to and it's giving me a reply. So that's why now it's getting a little scary. But to me, I mean, I'm not a policy expert, but if I were one of these people in Congress or where they are, I wouldn't focus too much on stopping the innovation because I don't think you can stop innovation. I would focus more on how do you stop the bad actors that will try to use these capabilities to do something bad. Like,
it's hard.
Just like InfoSec, right, and security. Like, hackers keeps improving, but then we improve on how to control them. And it's going to be, to me, it's going to be the same. So that's what I would focus on. I wouldn't slow it down. I would just try to identify what harm can be made and then maybe use the same tools to identify, like, I'm sure we can build AI models to see if a text was generated by an AI model or a human. some, as a quick example. But.
And eventually Minority Report. Yeah, John.
Hi, John Mayo, Georgetown University. Thank you all for a lot of great insights. A number of people in this room and online are either academics or sit in research positions with a lot of capacity to begin to answer important questions. Let me put each of you in the role, not just being on a policy panel, but in the role of policymakers. What question or questions should policymakers be asking of the research community right now to answer the critical questions that you've been kicking around of addressing and moving forward smart policy? And the question is to everybody.
First, they need to allocate a lot of money to economists for research.
It goes without saying.
I mean, a couple of things. I would say, number one, what identity risks can these tools cause? Like, how people can use these tools to pretend to be somebody else and then do harm. And then discrimination. How can these tools be used to discriminate? In my reality, pricing, for example, this model is gonna get just smarter and smarter, but to the point that they will be able to measure the price sensitivity of one person versus another. And then potentially these two people can get the same goods at the same time at a different price. That would be discrimination. So, these are two things that I'm thinking now, how they can be used to make harm and pretending to be someone else, so identity and discrimination.
So, assuming the researchers but economists, okay, so I'll talk to economists. So theorists need to help us identify what the market failures are. We just don't know what they could be. And empiricists need to identify historical examples, historical being like anything that happened before today that you can get data on, that help us understand those market failures in contexts that that are different from what's going to happen, because they happened in the past, but are still representative of the underlying model of the theory. And that's kind of it.
So actually, Elina, so we should acknowledge that there are people who think other than economists, even though we don't like to. But
I was just going to go off on a rant about that, but okay.
Please, by all means. But unlimited budget. What would you want people to be studying about AI in the countries you study?
So I'll try to answer both questions. For me, I'd like to go back to the question I raised earlier: is what is the point of optimization? Mm-hmm. Is it just to create less friction in production, or is there more? And as a corollary to that question, are we using the right metrics of success? What does success look like? And I would bet that it looks quite different for different countries. And for me, as a natural outcome of those questions, we need to be talking to more than just economists. Mm-hmm. And we need to be talking to linguists, to artists, of course, to lawyers, to policy
Not
folks. But we need to be thinking about the less conventional stakeholders that should be involved in these conversations, because the digital platform is not just for technologists, it's not just for economists, it's supposed to be for everyone, and if that's the aim, then everyone else needs to be involved.
Other questions? Yeah. Oh, sorry, I didn't see you had them. Go ahead.
Thank you a lot for this conversation. It's very inspiring to see the connection shaping between policy making and how companies are actually organized. My question would be, sometimes we look at how investments in technology are impacting on firm performances, but we miss what's in the middle, right? So if you look and you scrape the website, what you find is that a lot of articles talking about a lot of AI projects that fail. Mm-hmm. And so the question could be, why? What's happening inside firm? If you zoom in the firm, what's happening there that is preventing companies to transform? Maybe that's a question for everybody here.
Question.
But the following question would be, how can policymakers help these transformations, right? Streamline this transformation.
Your question was when AI fails?
Why AI projects fail? AI projects.
This isn't...
within firms.
Yeah, this isn't our company, but this is an example of, I don't know if you guys remember when they were trying to train an AI model to detect for tuberculosis. Did you? And it was, and then it's like, oh, they're feeding all of this information, and all this information is, and the way to train the model was to show images of people who did have tuberculosis. And so when they did deploy the model, a lot of people, one, in the Western world, you don't see tuberculosis as often, right? And so they were getting a lot of misdiagnoses. And it was like, why? And actually, the year in which those that machinery was created is what the AI model was trained on. The problem is you can train AI, you can say this is tuberculosis, like images of it, and the AI can come with an output, but it's really hard to know what led to the output, other than you're seeing, oh, these are now matching. So when that model was deployed, it was actually identifying just years in which the image came from, not whether or not it was tuberculosis. Does that make sense? So that's an example of how AI can do a wealth of good, but there are going to be some anomalies, right, where there's some failures, and then you have to go back, and I think that's how you learn. You learn from these mistakes. Now, when the mistakes could be life-threatening, you put them in another bucket, and the regulation needs to be more stringent, et cetera.
Can I just offer two examples from Southeast Asia? So one, in the region writ large, there's a regional telco that tried to launch an application to know your customer a lot better. But that application fell flat because they were using data sets from American and European customer bases. So they learned from that. Another example is from Vietnam, actually. So a certain search company, an MNC, went into Vietnam and deployed a voice assistant. They had the goodwill to deploy it in Vietnamese, but what they didn't account for was the regional differences in dialects in Vietnam. So in Vietnam, you have the northern, southern, and central dialects. And so it worked, but not very well at all. And actually, a local company took a page from that and said, you know, we can do a much better job of this because we're local, we know the context, we know the dialects. And they did that, and it worked so much better.
Yep.
Yeah, hi. I guess I'm wondering about maybe AI as electricity or a general purpose technology. But with some of the models that we see, like ChatGPT or BERT or Roberta or YouTube's recommendation algorithm, right? These are sophisticated algorithms that required a tremendous amount of data and lots of computational resources to derive for it to be like kind of a product that the general person could use. There was a big backstop of resources that had to have there. So if we're thinking about AI as this kind of electricity, are we getting a concentration of power within like 4 or 5 tech companies that have the computational resources to create these kind of generationally changing models that everybody will use, but there's really only 3 tech companies that have the resources to be able to produce these models. It's not like everybody gets a ChatGPT. It's that OpenAI has ChatGPT and they have to license out whatever they're doing with it. So is this the future we're moving towards, that there's really only like 4 companies that have these big models that everybody else uses, and that's the way that we're going?
So we actually thought about that, and so our generative AI platform is going to be scalable, and it's built so that people can build on top of it. That is going to be, otherwise there would be that issue that it would cost billions to build these large language LLMs, but large language models. And so that's our way of democratizing that access to it by allowing both large and small individuals, corporations to build upon ours.
I mean, also just to play devil's advocate, the very presence that this came from OpenAI is kind of a counter to your question, because OpenAI was nothing. I mean, I know they have this complicated investment from Microsoft, but it wasn't one of the big ones. It doesn't invalidate your question. Right. Other questions? No. Yeah.
Thank you. This is Ivo from CGAP. Great discussion, great conference. I must say that my head is a little bit spinning now because, I come from financial sector regulation background, and there is one key principle that regulators try to adhere to, which is regulation should be technology neutral. And now we're talking about regulating technology as a sort of core of the discussion. And I'm wondering, is it a common approach in a general purpose technology to come up with one single overarching framework for how to regulate the thing? Or, Fabio kind of alluded to the point of there should be a risk-based approach, but there are probably very different risks in very different sectors and use cases, et cetera. So, I'm kind of confused whether it's a meaningful approach to have a one overarching regulatory framework towards what is effectively a technology of many use cases.
So I think that a useful starting point, it's a great question. The useful starting point is regulation should or could be technology neutral, but technology creates new challenges. And so when technology creates new challenges, we often need regulations to deal with these new kinds of market failures. Sometimes we decide to make it technology specific, like the Federal Aviation Administration, and sometimes we decide to make it technology agnostic, like the Federal Trade Commission. But underlying it is that technology and technological change lead to new kinds of market failures and new need for regulation.
And also, it does look like AI is a general purpose technology, but we don't really know that yet. It takes a while to learn these things. Other questions? Now, I want to end on something that's not exactly AI necessarily, and maybe it's a little narrow, but I wanted to follow up on something Avi said for the researchers and students in the room. You made the point about not paying too much attention to statistical significance. And I agree with you. And in fact, I was working on a paper yesterday where I didn't have any stars in my table because I agree with your stars point. But when we're talking about policy, and sometimes policies have no effects. So how do you do research and when one possible outcome is no effect if you're not allowed to look at statistical significance? Are you supposed to get a very precise 0?
There's nothing magical about being 95% confident
Nope,
about anything.
absolutely not.
Okay, and so the push that we've seen in the research community over the past decade or so to get rid of these statistical significance is there used to be this old art where you'd essentially include or take away covariates to move your significance from from 1.95 to 1.97. That's a waste of time.
Yep.
And instead, we recognize that what matters is your point estimate and your standard deviation your standard error around the point estimate, and that will give you a sense of both magnitude and confidence. And so, especially, I would argue, especially in a world where we're, with policies that are changing and with extraordinary uncertainty, the explicit recognition of that uncertainty, even for big effects on average, has got to be better than us saying, we're 95% confident that this small effect is real, and therefore we're going to make policy based on this tiny little effect.
I really like the point because I'm actually working on 2 papers where we're doing exactly that kind of thing. But in policy, it's always hard to convince people of no effect. And papers don't want to publish no result. So this is a different discussion. But anyway, I just wanted to make sure to address it. Okay, last chance. Okay, well then please join me in thanking the panelists. I thought they were great.